Founded during the Greek Hellenistic period of history, the Library of Alexandria in Egypt was one of the largest and most significant libraries of the ancient world. It was part of an academic institution founded by Ptolemy I in the early 3rd century BC that brought together some of the world's best scholars. 1,000 or more scholars would be living at this institution of higher learning at any given time, where they would conduct scientific research, lecture, and collect as much literature as possible from around the world. Foreign texts were translated from Assyrian, Persian, Indian, Jewish, and other languages into the common language of Koine Greek. Ptolemy II, 285 to 247 BC, funded an expansion of the library, and he is said to have commissioned an Egyptian priest named Manetho to compose an account of Egyptian history. Manetho's list of ancient Egyptian kings and dynasties became the foundation for the chronology used by Egyptologists today. Ptolemy II is also said to have commissioned 70 Jewish scholars to translate the Hebrew Torah into Greek for inclusion in the Library of Alexandria. The first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Torah or the Pentateuch, were translated from Hebrew into Greek, and this became the beginning of the Septuagint. Other books from the Hebrew Bible would be translated over the next century or so and added to this work. The Septuagint was a commonly used translation during the time of Christ and the Apostles in the 1st century AD. We see this reflected in the fact that most of the Old Testament quotes found in the New Testament are from the Septuagint. Today, our Bibles are mostly based upon the Hebrew Masoretic text, rather than the Greek Septuagint. The Masoretic text is also the authoritative Hebrew text of the Torah in Rabbinic Judaism. In other words, they believe that the words written by their ancestor Moses have been successfully and accurately copied and passed down throughout their generations. Although the oldest surviving complete manuscript, the Leningrad Codex, dates to around 1000 AD, scholars will affirm a stabilized Hebrew Bible to the 1st century AD since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls reveal less corruption in the Masoretic text than we might expect, given that about 1,000 years separate the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Leningrad Codex. They demonstrate the unusual accuracy in preserving the text over such a long period of time. The original 5 books of Moses were completed when Deuteronomy was written and Moses died in 1440 BC. The Israelites were not always faithful in observing the laws, but the book of the Law of Moses was always meticulously copied and passed down throughout the generations. About 800 years after Moses, in the 18th year of Josiah, Hilkiah found the book of the Law of Moses, and they kept the Passover as instructed in the text. Then about 100 years after Josiah, we see Ezra reading from the book of the Law of Moses, and then they kept the Feast of Tabernacles, as the text commanded. Then there's a gap of only about 100 years between Ezra and the earliest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's very reasonable to believe that our current Old Testament texts, based mainly on the Masoretic, are reliable copies of the original works. We should also keep in mind that unlike the Masoretic text, the Septuagint is a translation from one language to another, and is subject to the challenges that come with that. Even so, we should not automatically dismiss the Septuagint when notable differences are seen between the Septuagint and the Masoretic. In this video, we're going to look at two places where these manuscripts differ, one in Genesis and one in Exodus. We'll see if we can figure out which texts were altered and what the reasons might be. We'll be looking first at Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. The Masoretic text reads, "Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. Many Bibles have a footnote for this verse indicating a textual variation. The Septuagint also has the word Cainan, so that it reads, "Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Cainan and Egypt was 430 years. The way the Masoretic text reads, we would have to use the other numbers provided in Scripture to see that the Israelites indeed were sojourners for 430 years, but 215 of those years were in Canaan, and only 215 were in Egypt. Most people don't do this arithmetic, which is evidenced by the many people that still teach that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. Since this verse is so easily misunderstood, we can imagine the scholars at Alexandria adding the word Canaan for the sake of clarity, as translators often do. We have examples of this being done in the New Testament, which was translated from Greek into English. Matthew chapter 1 verse 6, for example, says, "And Jesse begot David the king. David the king begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah." Notice the words in italics and the footnote associated with them. It says, words in italic type have been added for clarity. They are not found in the original Greek. So the original Greek reads, "David the king begot Solomon by her of Uriah." We know from 1 Samuel that this is speaking of Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. By adding the words, "who had been the wife," the translators clarified for us what could be known by reading elsewhere in the Scriptures. This is what the scholars at Alexandria did with Exodus 12:40 by adding the word Canaan. They made something more readily understandable that would otherwise require information from elsewhere in Scripture. The next scripture we'll be looking at is Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 through 24, and there are significant differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. This is the chronology of the period between the flood and the birth of Abraham. The numbers from the Masoretic text add up to 292 years. Josephus agrees with the numbers in the Masoretic text when he writes, Abram was born in the 292nd year after the deluge. The numbers in the Septuagint are vastly different from those in the Masoretic. The Septuagint has 100 more years for each man from Arphaxad to Serug and 50 more years for Nahor. These variations are too systematic to be considered accidental, and we have good reason to doubt the Septuagint, since the Septuagint numbers in Genesis chapter 5 cannot even be reconciled to themselves. The Septuagint numbers in Genesis 5 have Methuselah outliving the flood by 14 years, which is impossible. The Septuagint and the Masoretic text are in agreement when they record 70 years for Terah, but the Septuagint lists a person named Cainan between Arphaxad and Shelah and assigns 130 years to him. These changes increase the time between the flood and the birth of Abraham by 780 years, stretching it from just under 300 years to over 1,000 years. We'll talk more about this man Cainan later. Before that, we'll look for any clues that might explain why the writers of the Septuagint would want to change the chronology. Let's go back to the Library of Alexandria and focus on Manetho's History of Egypt, and we'll compare it to the history written by Herodotus. Herodotus was an ancient Greek historian who is often called the father of history, and he lived a couple hundred years before the Septuagint and Manetho's History of Egypt. Around 450 BC, Herodotus traveled to Egypt and interviewed the Egyptian priests in Memphis, Thebes, and Heliopolis, and wrote down what they told him. Herodotus's list of consecutive pharaohs from Sesostris to Psammetichus III contains around 20 kings and spans about 500 years. We can anchor Psammetichus III at 525 BC because he was the reigning pharaoh when Cyrus the Great's son Cambyses conquered Egypt. Herodotus visited Egypt less than 100 years after Psammetichus III was ruling there. As we compare Herodotus to Manetho's History of Egypt, we'll consider the observations of Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton lived in the 17th century AD, and among the many things he's famous for, he also did extensive research in the study of ancient kingdoms. He found that many nations, through vanity, had exaggerated the antiquity of their origins. Some extended their royal lineage far back into the mythical past, to when the gods ruled, to make their nation appear even more ancient. Egypt was certainly no exception. As Newton compared Herodotus to Manetho's list of pharaohs for the same period, from Sesostris to Psammetichus III, he found that the list had grown from about 20 kings to over 130 kings, and the time span grew from around 500 years to over 2,700 years. Sir Isaac Newton determined that Manetho's dynasties are almost a complete work of fiction, containing scores of unnamed kings, for which we have no other indication that they ever existed. These fictitious dynasties are the basis for the greatly exaggerated early Egyptian history that dates the Great Pyramid of Giza hundreds of years before the flood, which of course is impossible. This seems to be a very good motive for wanting to push the date of the flood back farther into the past. It's not a coincidence that the writing of Manetho's work coincides with the writing of the Septuagint and its corruption of the Holy Scriptures to better accommodate the exaggerated Egyptian chronology. As we mentioned earlier, the Septuagint not only added time to the chronology, but also an entire fictitious person, like Manetho did with his abundance of pharaohs. Cainan was inserted between Arphaxad and Shelah in the Septuagint version of Genesis 11. He is not found in the Masoretic text of Genesis 11. nor is he found in the genealogy listed in 1 Chronicles chapter 1. And for further proof that this Cainan in the Septuagint version of Genesis 11 is fictional, he's not even found in the Septuagint version of 1 Chronicles that was translated later that century. This fictional man Cainan did, however, find his way into the New Testament a few hundred years later. He shows up again in the Gospel of Luke in what was surely a scribal error entered by a copyist that thought he was making a correction by importing it from the Septuagint. This corruption of the Greek New Testament manuscripts must have happened very shortly after the initial writing of Luke, because the overwhelming majority of surviving Luke manuscripts have this extra Cainan. However, one of the oldest surviving papyrus fragments, P75, does not contain this extra Cainan, and it is older than most of the manuscripts that do contain the extra Cainan. The errors in the Septuagint have unfortunately caused many people to incorrectly believe that the Bible chronology is not accurate and that the genealogies have gaps in them. Isaac Newton noted that Manetho's History of Egypt added fictitious kings to make their gods and nation look more ancient, and in so doing, pushed their origins back beyond what is possible. Their lineage would precede the birth of nations and new languages, as well as the global flood, neither of which are possible. In their vanity, Egypt not only fabricated much of their own history, they tampered with the Holy Scriptures to push back the year of the flood farther into the past to accommodate their fabrication. Egyptian chronology is in need of serious revision, but that will prove difficult as long as Manetho's division of dynasties remains as the universal standard for Egyptologists. You can download the chart seen in this video by clicking the links in the description of this video. You can also download the Timeline PDF, which contains the complete Bible chronology in a spreadsheet, perfect for referencing on your tablet, phone, or computer.